My name is Lorraine Murray. I'm a geoscientist. I've been in 50 countries. I worked in 2 nuclear weapons labs as a geoscientist. I am a Quaker, so I do not work on weapons of war. I don't believe in war. And I'm doing this to educate and inform the public about what is happening to public health and the health of the environment because of the weapons that are being used now that affect the entire biosphere and the entire planet. As you know, on March 11th, an earthquake was detected or measured off the coast of Japan. That's Fukushima province, prefecture in red. I've been very, very fortunate to be invited 20 times on speaking tours to Japan since the year 2000. And even though I had worked in 2 nuclear weapons labs, the Lawrence Berkeley lab where the Manhattan Project started, and the Lawrence Livermore lab in Livermore, which is about 45 miles southeast from Berkeley, where I live, I knew nothing about nuclear weapons. I just heard people talking about big mushroom clouds, and I just had no idea what the effects are until I was invited to Japan in the year 2000 because I was a whistleblower on the Yucca Mountain Project in Nevada, which is the most important public works project the U.S. has ever undertaken. And it was to construct an underground repository for all of the nuclear waste produced in the United States from, first of all, the nuclear weapons program, after with the Manhattan Project that never ended, and the nuclear power industry. They produce highly radioactive, very toxic waste, and depleted uranium and other Navy weapons and reactors, and the space program, very, very radioactive plutonium that's much hotter than what they use in nuclear bombs, is produced for power supplies in spacecraft. And Carl Grossman has written very good books about it. He's a really good investigative journalist, but he's also a professor, and he's a friend of mine. So the U.S. has been producing nuclear waste since even before World War II with nowhere to store it. So all this nuclear waste is sitting at the facilities that generated it, and there's still nowhere to put it. When I was working at Livermore, I was doing geochemistry research on the WIPP project in New Mexico. That's the Waste Isolation Pilot Project. And the Norwegians, the Finns, the Swedish, the Swedes have underground nuclear waste repositories in crystalline rock. In other words, granite or very, very solid rock bodies. Maybe in the 60s or 70s, when nuclear energy was getting going, a senator in, I think it was Vermont or New Hampshire, knew that most of the nuclear power plants would be on the East Coast, and he didn't want that nuclear waste on the East Coast, and he didn't want it in his state. So he passed a law in Congress prohibiting the storage of nuclear waste in any crystalline rock. The safest place to put it, even there it's not safe. But he absolutely sabotaged the ability for the United States to safely store nuclear waste. And the New Mexico, the NRC, and before that the Atomic Energy Commission. NRC is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that succeeded the AEC. they went from state to state to state to state, and they got kicked out of every single state, not only by the citizens, by the elected officials as well. It was unanimous. It's the one time America has been, any state was really completely unanimous between politicians and citizens. So it ended up in New Mexico, where the Los Alamos lab is, and it ended up in an underground salt deposit from a Permian ocean many millions of years before. I was at Livermore working on the geochemistry, and I heard about it. I didn't really know very much about it. I was busy in labs, you know, talking to people and doing whatever. But then they moved it. Well, what happened is the New Mexico legislature voted to allow that pilot project in New Mexico. But they demanded that the federal government build a whole new infrastructure of freeways and highways in New Mexico. As soon as the freeways and highways were completed, the legislature voted that no nuclear waste could be transported on highways and freeways in New Mexico. So the government had to regroup, reorganize, and they picked the Nevada test site where 1,300 nuclear weapons tests have been conducted. And those nuclear weapons tests have destroyed the health and the mental health and the health of the environment of the entire United States. The SAT scores for all children who took them in the United States declined 12% from children born in 1945 who were not exposed to any ionizing radiation until children born in 1963 were exposed to peak levels in 1963 when the U.S. military and the nuclear establishment detonated 250 nuclear weapons at the Nevada test site because they knew the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty would end their ability to do atmospheric testing. It takes 2 years to set up a nuclear weapons test. How they did it, 250 in 1 year, I have no idea. But I bet it was with baling wire and chewing gum a whole lot of the way. And when I began to investigate HAARP, which is the new weapon of mass destruction, replacing the nuclear weapons in the U.S. military arsenal, I understood why so many atmospheric tests had been done, and that they were co-developing with the Soviet Union HAARP, the new weapon of mass destruction, in order to weaponize the atmosphere and the energy of the universe, the energy in our environment, the energy in natural systems and natural events. They had to understand how the atmosphere worked. Well, we didn't have research labs up there high up in the atmosphere. So what they had to do was to inject huge amounts of ionized particles, and that's what comes out of nuclear bombs, into the Earth's magnetic field and study the behavior of those particles as they interacted with the magnetic field. And so that's why the Soviets did those huge hydrogen bomb tests in the Arctic. And Dr. Levin, who was a Canadian doctor in Alberta, studied the biological impact of all that radiation. And Canadian doctors were able to calculate that every person in the Northern Hemisphere received the equivalent of an X-ray, a chest X-ray, from those nuclear bomb tests. So we've been nuclear guinea pigs since 1945. So the WIP project was moved to the Yucca Mountain project in Nevada, And I was at the Livermore Nuclear Weapons Lab when the canisters storing the nuclear waste came back from WIPP and from Yucca Mountain. And the bacteria in 5 years had eaten the canisters that cost $2.5 billion to make, along with the Yucca Mountain tunnels and everything. And it's basically, the bacteria ate the beer can and left the beer. So, America's most important public works project ended up in the courts about 5 years ago in Washington, D.C., and the judge said to the Department of Energy, number one, you have guaranteed the nuclear waste will be safe only 10,000 years, but the National Academy of Sciences, which is the highest scientific authority, recommended 250,000 years. Your science is science fraud, so I'm ordering you to throw everything out and start all over again. That $2.5 billion that got them into that courtroom was ratepayers' money. So nuclear power, nuclear weapons are not compatible with life, and they're the most expensive weapons that have ever been developed on this planet. What species kills their young for energy? What species kills their young for security? What species kills their young for power? None. It's complete insanity. So I'm going to talk now about the aftermath of nuclear power and how very, very dangerous it is now that Fukushima has happened. Fukushima is located on the east side of the sort of northern side of Honshu, which is the main island in Japan. And offshore, a couple of 100 miles offshore from Fukushima, where 2 nuclear power plants are located on the shore, on the beach of that side of the island. All of the nuclear power plants, almost all of them in Japan, are right on the beach or right next to the ocean, so they can use the seawater for cooling. An earthquake of magnitude 9.1 occurred at 12:46 a.m. on Friday, March 11th. A magnitude 9 earthquake releases the energy that would be released by 1 million Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. And what this HARP system, this new weapon of war, is doing is it's artificially triggering natural events that release huge amounts of energy that can be used as a destructive force. That earthquake that occurred at 12:46 a.m. was followed by a 30 or 35-foot tsunami. Now, Japan has a history of tsunamis. Japan has a history of earthquakes. So temples and Edo period farmhouses and older buildings are built without a single nail in them, or screw or bolt. They're all wood, and they're constructed so that they rock and move with the earthquakes, and they're left standing when the earthquake is over. Indigenous technology cannot be improved on. If we return to indigenous technology, we would be much better off, we would be much safer, we would be producing food that is 5 times more nutritious than what we're eating now. And with indigenous agricultural technologies, you produce 10 times as much food. So I'm all for indigenous. That earthquake and tsunami flooded the reactor buildings. There are 6 reactors at the Fukushima #1 plant, and I think there are 4 more at the Fukushima #2 plant. The Reactors are General Electric reactors. They have Siemens controllers. Siemens is a German company that run all of the reactors and open and close valves and pump water and just keep that whole thing operating. And 90 minutes after the cooling stops in the cooling ponds, which are on top of the reactors, there are 7 cooling ponds at Fukushima with 6 of them on top of the reactors. And there are 600,000 spent fuel rods from 40 years of operating those reactors. A spent fuel rod weighs about 1,200 pounds. It has over 1,300 isotopes in it, and it is exactly what is produced when a nuclear bomb explodes. So, nuclear weapons testing injected those dangerous fission products high into the atmosphere, and 85% of that radioactive detritus or dust or whatever it is, byproducts, this is at levels like Chernobyl release close to the ground and has poisoned the whole world. And now we have something that is at least 10 times worse, many times worse than Chernobyl, because the reactor at Chernobyl that caught on fire was half the size of the small reactor in Unit 1, and it was mostly fuel rods that were uranium that burned instead of the spent fuel rods that represent a real nuclear war that burned at Fukushima. And also, because of that, the whole top third of Honshu, all the way up to the tip of Honshu, that is uninhabitable now. It is 3 times more radioactive on the ground than after Chernobyl. It's uninhabitable. It's over 3,000 becquerels per second of extremely dangerous radionuclides that are decaying across that whole top third of Honshu. And when the U.S. military evacuated Kanto, which is that light blue area, it's Tokyo and Yokosuka, which is the biggest U.S. Navy base in Japan, where the self-defense forces have their ships, the Japanese ships, and a very wide region where also agriculture is done. When the U.S. military bailed out of that area, I knew it was really bad. So, Japan has 55 reactors in a country the size of California. There are multiple reactors in each power plant, and I've been in some of them. I've investigated and inspected them. The most dangerous nuclear power plant is, I think it's this one. It's, no, it's down here, one of these. It's called Hamaoka. Now, Japan is extremely dangerous to choose as a site to put any nuclear technologies, because Japan is sitting, it's an island arc, sitting on top of 4 tectonic plates. So the Philippine plate is moving north, the Pacific plate is moving west and trying to subduct under China, with Japan bobbing on top of it. The North American plate is moving south, and the China plate is moving east. So it's a terrible, terrible place. It would be like trying to crawl on top of a gunny sack with about 5 big hogs in it, all wiggling and jumping around and pushing each other. And I'd like to see you or me or anyone try to stay on top of that gunny sack. So that's basically the tectonic setting of Japan. And the Hamaoka plate is near the junction of 3 plates. I was able to get the Tokyo Electric Power Company map which has the faults and the strata, the geologic layers or rock types and everything on it, because that's what TEPCO submitted to the Japanese government in order to operate, for the license to operate Hamaoka. So I went to Hamaoka and I had a press conference there. And then I went to the prefecture headquarters where the governor and the prefecture government operates, and I had another press conference there. And I had walked all around Hamaoka the day before and collected rocks and took pictures and observed the intake and exhaust pipes. They're huge. They're twice as wide as this room. They consume huge amounts of water for the cooling systems. And I held up the map and showed all the reporters what it looked like. And I said, can you see the faults on this map? Can you see how the reactors are carefully placed between the faults? They said, yeah. And I said, instead of the rocks lying flat like they're supposed to, they're standing on their sides. And I said, this is not a safe place to build a nuclear power plant. And they said, but TEPCO told us it was safe. So I took a baggie out of my backpack and I held up a baggie and I said, these are the rocks that those reactors are sitting on. And I took a rock out and I crumbled it like sugar. And they said, we're all going to write stories about this. And all of them wrote articles that were in the Japan newspapers the next day. Even the most conservative one, the Yomiuri News, which was started by a military war crimes character who was very pro-nuclear power, and he used the Yomiuri News to promote nuclear power in Japan and sell it to the public. Even their reporter wrote an article about it. So here we have a country that is just an accident waiting to happen. And I wrote a 2004 article for the Japan Times after the Hamaoka visit, and I hope all of you will read it. It's in English on the internet, and it's called Japan's Deadly Game of Nuclear Roulette. Now the tragic thing is that every nuclear power plant can be converted to natural gas, because all that reactor does is boil water to turn the turbines to produce electricity. You can take the reactor out, put a gas burner in, produce 8 times more energy, much cheaper, eliminate the environmental hazard of the emissions, because all of the radiation from operations every day goes up the stack. And it ends up in all the fields and the food and in the water, drinking water, and in babies' teeth. I've collected 6,000 baby teeth from children living around nuclear power plants in the U.S. with a small group of scientists. Dr. Ernest Sternglass is one of them, and he helped to convince the Senate to sign the Partial Test Ban Treaty in 1963. I also collected baby teeth in Japan, in Tokyo, and the radiation levels were the same as for children living around nuclear power plants in the U.S. The 2 babies that had the highest strontium-90 levels in their baby teeth were born in Washington, D.C. So, nuclear power is not compatible with life, with welfare, with good health, but it sure is compatible with bankers, and that's why we have it. And the other reason we have it is because Queen Elizabeth, I call her Queenie, owns all of the mineral rights to 27 countries, the British Isles, and many territories, the Commonwealth. And she even owns the mineral rights to the international maritime limits, which are 200 miles offshore. So all the wind farms, the BP oil platforms offshore, they all belong to her personally. She owns over 35 trillion, I'm sorry, she owns land worth over $35 trillion. She's the richest person in the world. And she has huge, huge uranium deposits in Canada, in Australia, in other countries. And it's completely worthless dust unless you have an industry, even a fraudulent and corrupt industry, that gives you a way to sell it. That's nuclear power. This is Hamaoka from the air. It's on the ocean, and the 4 reactors you can see. These are the 4 reactors, and these are the turbine buildings where the steam is piped there to turn the turbines to produce electricity. After 90 minutes after cooling stops in a nuclear power plant, the reactors go into meltdown. Now, after the accident, the cooling systems did not work for almost 24 hours. They couldn't get the backup systems to work. The pump for the cooling systems that operate normally is down close to the ocean. It's right on the beach. So that got flooded and destroyed by the tsunami. The first backup system is diesel, and that's in the basement underneath the reactor. And after a 32 or 34-foot wave tsunami went over that building, it flooded that system. Then there was the battery backup system. They couldn't get that to work. So almost 24 hours after the earthquake, they still did not have cooling in those reactors. So they were actually in advanced stages of meltdown. In September, TEPCO secretly put MOX fuel in unit number 3. MOX fuel is mixed uranium and oxide. It's extremely dangerous. It's very hazardous when it escapes into the environment, and it's very hot and hard to control. That was unit number 3, which was the second one that blew up. That's the plutonium and uranium oxides and spent fuel rod detritus and dust and smoke that's going up into the air. And that has now contaminated the whole northern hemisphere. This is the control room. Now there are the emergency responders in not very effective protective gear. They really should have air tanks and complete covered enclosed suits on them, but they don't. It's so radioactive in that plant that everyone who has worked there is going to die of radiation poisoning. This is what I call Japan's kamikaze emergency responders. And they're being paid $5,000 a day to work there until they die. And the scam of it all is that General Electric, I believe, has been directing TEPCO on the emergency response. And like 9/11, like Hurricane Katrina, like the BP disaster in the Gulf, and now Fukushima, the regulatory agencies have stayed back. The politicians have stayed back. The TEPCO officials have stayed back. The international agencies have stayed back. So TEPCO has been running that the whole time. They do not have the technical ability to make the correct decisions to respond to this disaster. And the tip-off tip-off was when Hillary Clinton announced as Secretary of State 4 or 5 days after the disaster that she was shipping a plane load of boron to Fukushima, and that's what they should have used on the first day since it was already in meltdown. And boron is what you dump on nuclear materials that are going into a runaway fission process because it absorbs the neutrons and stops the fissioning. So she announced that she was sending a plane load of boron to Fukushima, and immediately, within a couple of hours, there was a denial in the press, in the mainstream U.S. media, that that boron was going, or that we were even sending anything. Now, what is that noise? Oh. So that was a tip-off right there that someone else was running that emergency response, and they were not running it to end the disaster, they were prolonging it. Oh, also, when you look at aerial photos and whoever robots or whatever took photos inside, in the aftermath, it's very clear that there's no way they could have gotten cooling systems or these reactors ever back to normal or under control. And so they absolutely should have covered everything with boron and shut down the fissioning and then cemented over the whole plant. Instead, they fooled around, they pumped salt water in. The salt water reacted with the exposed molten fuel because not only was one of the reactors ruptured from the top to the bottom, but the fuel rods were ruptured from heat expansion of the pellets as they got hotter and hotter. And then the seawater got into contact with the molten fuel, or the not so molten fuel, but the hot fuel. And it created reactor number 3, which is the MOX reactor, blew up. Now what's really interesting is that the USS Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier was sitting 100 miles offshore when the MOX building blew up. It was Prime Minister Nakasone in the 1980s of Japan who went to Washington, D.C. and made a secret agreement with President Ronald Reagan to bring MOX fuel to Japan. Interesting. The MOX building blows up and the USS Ronald Reagan is sitting there. They set up helicopters, measured the radiation, and got the hell out of there because they were contaminating the aircraft carrier, the planes, the personnel, everything. And then reactor number 3 blew up, and reactor number 4 did not. It blew up, but not as badly. So they had a total disaster. By this time, the rods had melted through the bottom of the reactors. The reactors and the molten fuel were melting through the bottom of the plant, and they are now down in the soil headed for the groundwater. There's no way to stop it now unless you tunnel under that reactor fuel that's moving down and pack boron under there. Finally, not very long ago, maybe a week ago, the U.S. government urgently requested that Japan stop using salt water to cool the reactors because the salt builds up in the pipes, it builds up inside the reactor, and it absolutely makes the disaster worse because it impedes the flow of water that's cooling what they're trying to cool. It's completely insane. Now, what happened is they put the MOX fuel in Unit 3 in September. In October, the Japanese government discovered that 63 computers in Japan had been infected with the Stuxnet computer virus. The Stuxnet computer virus was written by the CIA and the Mossad to be inserted with a flash drive into a computer system inside power plants that use Siemens controllers because power plants are off-grid and offline. and that is to protect them from terrorist events. 1 month before this disaster, an Israeli security team had just finished installing a new security system, and they must have been the ones who put the Stuxnet virus into the Fukushima operating system. And that's why they couldn't get any of the backup systems working after the earthquake and tsunami. The Stuxnet virus was also used 6 months ago in Iran at the Bushehr centrifuge facility where they enrich uranium to make nuclear fuel for their nuclear power plants. It hides in the computer system and is programmed to go off at a certain time. And so in the Bushehr plant, all of the controllers and the workers were sitting in the control room, and all the dials said everything was operating normally, everything was just fine. But in the room where the centrifuges were, that virus made those centrifuges go faster and faster, accelerating until they just flew apart. So that virus destroyed half of the centrifuges in that Bushehr facility. It was like 400 or 450. This is one of the buildings. This is probably this is probably the MOX one, because it had the biggest explosion. And you can see that it's kind of sort of unlikely that the cooling ponds on top of the reactor are even there. And it's also pretty realistic to imagine that they probably could never get that cooling system working. Anyway, it looks pretty destroyed to me. This is sort of hard to see, but it's a good example or a good summary of what happened on each day, and the power output and so forth and so on. So you can see that unit number 1 is the one more to the right. That blew up on March 12th. Unit number 2 blew up March 15th. Unit number 3, which is the MOX unit, blew up on March 14th. And unit number 4 blew up on March 15th. And they hardly even reported that the 4th one had blown up. And they kept putting out in the news in Japan and here that they were working hard to try and save the reactors. Well, it's so obvious there was nothing to save. So what they were really doing was delaying making critical decisions about introducing boron to stop the fissioning and then cementing over these plants. And what they were doing was accelerating the emission and the creation of more problems with more melting, and then it gave the reactors time and the molten fuel to leak down into the ground. This is the cesium-131 plumes that were released from Fukushima, and this is March 18th, the day that they reached the west coast of North America. On March 17th, public health officials in the counties in California, and I have 2 letters, one from Sonoma County, north of the Bay Area, and one from Santa Clara County, which is where Stanford is in Silicon Valley. The public health officials released letters to all doctors in those counties telling them not to give American patients who were concerned about radiation exposure iodine tablets. The amount of radiation would be insignificant, and iodine is dangerous for your system. couple of days after that, San Francisco reported 18,000 times higher levels of radioactive iodine-131 in the drinking water in San Francisco than the EPA standard allows. On March 17th, the same day that those letters went out that prevented the protection of American Californians' thyroids, and thyroid iodine is also in every cell in your body. And since maybe in the last 20 or 30 years, the iodine levels in Americans has dropped 50%. So they are obviously causing nutritional problems in American food. The warning about the danger of iodine being toxic in the body is absolute total baloney, because if you look at the iodine levels in indigenous people who live on seaweed, on the Japanese, their iodine levels are at least 100 times higher. And Americans are already depleted by 50%. So how in the world could the U.S. Surgeon General, who, by the way, wears a military uniform with bars on it because he's a military official, why is American public health under the military? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because when the nuclear weapons program was being developed, they all knew it was absolutely devastating to the public health and to the health of the environment. So the Atomic Energy Commission and the military formed the EPA to hide that truth from the Americans. They started the National Cancer Institute, the National Institutes of Health, and the Centers for Disease Control. So why is the military and the AEC, or now the NRC, running our health agencies? The answer is to protect the nuclear weapons and the nuclear power programs. And they've stopped measuring radiation, radioactive iodine in milk. The Canadian government and the US government said the amount of radiation that will be in our environment is minimal, it's not dangerous to public health, but the Canadian government moved their British Columbia radiation monitoring program from the coast to Kamloops, which is very far inland, and that was to protect their own workers, but also to not have a paper trail on the very high levels of ionizing radiation that was being rained out along the coastal areas and then moving inland. The EPA announced that they had 124 radiation monitoring stations in the US, but they said 24 are broken, and they said we're not measuring any elevated levels, it's all harmless. The Canadian government denied there was any harmful radiation in the environment, and so I called my radiation scientists around the world, and they gave me data from the Norwegian and the German facilities that actually do monitoring in the environment for the partial test ban, for the non-proliferation treaty, to make sure no one is testing weapons illegally. And those are the two best sites that I've seen. This is actually an animated map that shows how the plume moves over 3 days. The one, I think this is an American one, but the German one and the Norwegian one, they've had it the whole time so that anyone, anywhere in the world can understand what is really happening and even evacuate. We should have all been evacuated from the West Coast. And this has just gotten worse. Now they're flooding it into the ocean. It's going to get into the ocean currents and be carried around the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, and eventually in 1 year it's completely mixed in the whole entire atmosphere of this planet. There's nowhere to hide. There's no way to stop it. There's no way to turn it off. It respects no borders. It respects no socioeconomic class. And it respects no religion. It's a global, universal, equal opportunity killer. And we can't see it. We can't taste it. You can't even measure it in the rain because it's low levels. But as it rains out, every day it accumulates in the environment. And what they're doing is serving us a dose of radiation that will last for thousands of years, that has contaminated all of North America. These are the monitoring, international monitoring stations. This is from a Dutch site, a German site, around the world. And these light up as the radiation is detected, and you can see the date on the right, upper right is changing. So it starts at March 24th, 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th, 29th. By the 29th, it had even reached Colombia in South America. Now, at the equator is very hot and moist, and air flowing from the poles, the North Pole and the South Pole, towards the equator, heats up and rises at the equator. So it's like a shower curtain that sort of prevents the air, the poisoned air from North America, the northern hemisphere, getting into the southern hemisphere. But eventually, because of all the processes in the dynamic troposphere, it ends up in the southern hemisphere too. Now, tell me if you really believe the government statements that it's harmless and it's a small amount and it's not really going anywhere. It sure is going everywhere, and they know exactly what they're doing because they've been monitoring radiation since 1945. This is cesium-137, and this is March 23rd, 24th, 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th, 29th, 30th, 31st, April 1st. Now, if you notice, the eastern part of Canada, let me show you where everything is. This is looking down on the North Pole, on the Arctic. This is the United States, Baja, Mexico, that's Hawaii, this is Canada, and this is the Arctic Ocean, this is Greenland, and this is Iceland. Here is Europe, this is Scandinavia, this is the Mediterranean and North Africa, and this is the Middle East. And if you watch Canada and Washington, D.C. and New York, you will notice that radiation flows around them. That is because a high pressure center where the HAARP heats that air up has formed a sort of a barrier or a high pressure to keep the radiation from contaminating that part. This is nothing. That red spot the days before, right after the explosions, were huge. That tongue went of red, very high levels of radiation, reached a third of the way to Hawaii. And if you also look, why is that going out to Hawaii? That's a very strange weather pattern when it's going east from west to east. It also went world. The highest levels of plutonium measured in the world were measured on the big island of Hawaii. I'm going to read something from a book called Unless Peace Comes, a scientific forecast of new weapons. This was published in 1968. And I'm reading from the chapter called How to Wreck the Environment. And this is by Dr. Gordon MacDonald, who was a JASON scientist. The JASON scientists are the modern Manhattan Project scientists, and they work for the Pentagon. They're civilians. They are paid by the MITRE Corporation, which was started by MIT scientists. And the military advisor to presidents, his name was Wheeler, Colonel Wheeler, who was murdered on New Year's Eve and found in a trash dump. He also worked for the MITRE Corporation, so he was most definitely involved with HAARP. Someone in the audience asked me to explain the difference between a magnitude 1, a magnitude 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 earthquake is that each magnitude is 1,000 times stronger than the last magnitude. So it's not 1, 2 is twice as strong as 1. It's 2 is 1,000 times stronger. And a magnitude 9 earthquake, the Fukushima earthquake, released the amount of energy that would be released, that's joules or calories, that would be released by 1 million Nagasaki and Hiroshima bombs, and they were about 30 kilotons. So this is a very, very interesting book. Professor MacDonald is Associate Director of the Institute of Geophysics and Planetary Physics at the University of California, Los Angeles. His researches have embraced a remarkable diversity of natural phenomena, and his professional interests are further extended by his participation in national science policy making. He is a member of President Johnson's Science Advisory Committee, and he's the one who developed tectonic warfare. The Fukushima earthquake is an example of it for the HAARP project. This is what HAARP is for: secret war and changing relationships. Deficiencies both in the basic understanding of the physical processes in the environment and in the technology of environmental change make it highly unlikely that environmental modification will be an attractive weapon system in any direct military confrontation in the near future. Man already possesses highly effective tools for destruction. Eventually, however, and eventually is right now, means other than open warfare may be used to secure national advantage. As economic competition among many advanced nations heightens, it may be to a country's advantage to ensure a peaceful natural environment for itself and a disturbed environment for its competitors. Operations producing such conditions might be carried out covertly, since nature's great irregularity permits storms, floods, droughts, earthquakes, and tidal waves to be viewed as unusual but not unexpected. Such a secret war need never be declared or even known by the affected populations. It could go on for years with only the security forces involved being aware of it. And I can guarantee you the security forces all collaborate with each other and trade information. The years of drought and storm would be attributed to unkindly nature, and only after a nation was thoroughly drained would an armed takeover be attempted. So perhaps the effects of the Fukushima disaster which is to weaken and to poison the food sources and water sources in Japan, will allow the U.S. military, with 14 bases in Japan, to take over such a strategic territory. I'm not saying that's definitely going to happen, but that would be something that could happen as a result of Fukushima. And it's really interesting that maybe the last 6 or 8 Japanese prime ministers only lasted 1 year because they were trying to make détente with China. And even the Japanese emperor did the unheard of thing. Maybe a year ago, within the last year, he went to China and officially apologized to the Chinese for the Japanese military takeover and the horrible things they did to China in World War II. My grandfather, Colonel Edwin Joseph McAllister, was commander of supply for the China-Burma campaign in World War II. He went to West Point when Eisenhower was there, and he drove a Jeep from India with the British and U.S. Army over the Himalayas on the Burma Road and the back way into China to push the Japanese out of China. So I'm real familiar with that era. In addition to their covert nature, a feature common to several modification schemes is their ability to affect the Earth as a whole. These are global wars now, from computer facilities and antennas that can touch any other place on this planet. The environment knows no political boundaries. It is independent of the institutions based on geography, and the effects of modification can be projected from any one point to any other on the Earth. There are HARP facilities at Gakona, Alaska, U.S., Newfoundland, Russia, Tromsø, Norway, British, Cyprus, British, Dushanbe in Tajikistan, I don't know who that is, Australia, British, Antarctica, joint, Brazil, probably American, Chile and Peru, those are probably American, and Arecibo in Puerto Rico. When the Haiti earthquake happened, I said, I bet you this is HARP, and I started digging. The Eurasian Mineral Company, mining company, had bought 25% of the mineral rights to Haiti 6 months before the earthquake. In December, before the earthquake, the World Bank met to consider the portfolio of the Eurasian Mining Company, who had applied to the World Bank for funds to develop mining in Haiti. The World Bank Committee met the day before the earthquake, but they did not vote to fund it. The earthquake happened the next day, and after the day after that, the committee met again and voted to fund it. When I investigated the funds that were donated for mineral exploration and assessment of how much they could get out of each mineral body in the Dominican Republic, that mineral belt extended into Haiti. I discovered that the Rockefellers, the British mining company interests, and Canadians were all invested in exploration and assessment of the mineral belt in the Dominican Republic that extended into Haiti. So they had a good idea. They were assessing how much money they could get out of each volcano. These are volcanoes that formed on the seafloor that were uplifted with the island to make the island of Haiti. So that's ancient seafloor. And so they pretty much calculate, they know how much they're going to get. They apply to the World Bank knowing how much their profits will be. And they're usually pretty accurate because now they can map from satellites 100% just 100% perfect assessment and finding exploration results. And they can also scan the ore bodies from space with a 30-watt signal. We wouldn't even buy a light bulb with 30 watts. And they can map the grade of the ore across the whole ore body. Bechtel has done it for decades from space. So they pretty much have probably cherry-picked a lot of the mineral sources, but they're also targeting Central Asian countries that are former colonies or parts of the Soviet Union. And these countries now have sort of collapsed without the Soviet support, and they're sort of, the infrastructures are decaying and education is dying, and so they're easy meat for transnational mining companies to go in and just strip mine without any environmental laws and totally poison and leave the environment wrecked in other weaker countries. The environment knows no political boundaries. It is independent of the institutions based on geography. And the effects of modification can be projected from any one point to any other on the Earth. Because environmental modification may be a dominant feature of future world decades, there is concern that this incipient technology is in total conflict with many of the traditional geographical and political units and concepts. This is a completely new form of war. Political, legal, economic, and sociological consequences of deliberate environmental modification, even for peaceful purposes, will be of such complexity that perhaps all our present involvements in nuclear affairs will seem simple. Our understanding of basic environmental science and technology is primitive, and I want to really emphasize that. They really don't know what they're doing. But still more primitive are our notions of the proper political forms and procedures to deal with the consequences of modification. All experience shows that less significant technological changes than environmental control finally transform political and social relationships. Experience also shows that these transformations are not necessarily predictable, and certainly this one isn't, releasing this huge amount of radiation into the environment. And that guesses we might make now based on precedent are likely to be quite wrong. It would seem, however, that these non-scientific, non-technological problems are of such magnitude that they deserve consideration by serious students throughout the world if society is to live comfortably in a controlled environment. So here he is, the developer of tectonic warfare, and he's warning people that this may not be such a good idea. Now, after reading that and understanding what is behind HAARP or how it might be applied, let's look at this disaster and maybe figure out some of the economic benefits behind executing a disaster like this. The Western North America, Canada, the United States, and Mexico is the food basket for North America. And what basically they've done is to contaminate it permanently with low-level radiation, which is contaminating the water, the livestock, the dairy products, the food, the air, even our gardens, our shoes, our umbrellas. And you should not go out in the rain for at least a year without full protective covering, including gloves, because this stuff goes right through your skin into your tissues and blood. And you should also leave the umbrella and your shoes or your rubber boots outside so that you don't track it all over your house and contaminate your house. In Tokyo already, there is yellow rain being reported. Yellow rain was reported after Chernobyl. It's the iodine 131 in the rain that is staining it yellow. And with that iodine is, remember, 13 other radioactive isotopes that are in that raindrop, in that puddle, in that stream running down the road. So you need to be very, very careful. And you should also avoid dairy products. Dairy products and drinking water are the main pathways for radiation into your body. It's just so horrible. It's really, I've been in such a shock since March 11th. I've been just stunned, terrified, because I knew what was happening to North America. And I'm really sorry to tell you this today, but I think people should know. I mean, I wanted to know, as horrible as it is, but at least people can take iodine. Here is some seaweed that one of the visitors today brought so that you could see it. You can go to health food stores and buy kelp powder. You just put like a half a teaspoon in water every day and drink it. You can get tincture of iodine for $2.50 at a drugstore, and you just rub it on your skin here over your thyroid. Your thyroid is between your Adam's apple and your collarbone, and it wraps around the esophagus. This is the most important thing to protect, and you have to do it for the next year. This stuff is going to continue to be coming across the ocean until they really stop it and cover it and entomb it. The half-life of iodine 131 is 8.5 days. It takes 10 half-lives for the radiation to diminish. So that's 85 days before it's diminished. And you want to flood your thyroid and your body with iodine so that it prevents uptake of the radioactive iodine. When you damage the thyroid, that is causing obesity, immune system damage, all kinds of problems in the body. The thyroid signals the mother's brain to control development of the brain in the developing baby. So it's pregnant women and babies and children and the elderly who are the most damaged, because people in their early and middle years are pretty healthy, they have functioning immune systems, and they're more able to survive the damage from the free radicals that are released by the radiation particles. So please go, everyone, today, and be sure you take iodine every day for at least the next 6 months or year. It may save your life. And remember the epidemic of thyroid cancer during and after bomb testing? We don't need to have that happen to us. We can prevent it. A lot of information on the internet. Now, not only are the food baskets poisoned with radiation, but it's going to bankrupt the farmers, the Japanese farmers and the farmers in the West. And that allows the international bankers to buy that farmland. They own a lot of it already, and to begin farming that radioactive farmland and feeding us food products that are contaminated. But they also are growing food in India. The Rothschilds have bought up huge amounts of farmland. Monsanto is also there with modified food. And the Rothschilds planned a long time ago to bankrupt the Japanese and European farmers so they could be the ones to sell them food. Why are they doing this? It's because